So slowly people are joining.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
fine. I can see him. I
Yeah,
can
and
see him up.
yeah, and we are on live on YouTube too.
Okay, excellent. If you hear a cat, I have a very needy cat who since since doing a lot of Zoom calls with COVID, he wants to see everybody who's on the screen. So you might see a cat here interrupted, but I'll try to keep him away from my computer.
Have you ever spoken with an Indian audience before?
Probably in an international meeting, but not recently. Where we've had 50 people all on one Zoom call, but including people from India.
Okay. Quite a few have already, quite a few have already joined.
Yeah, I can see them up above my screen.
Just maybe 1 or 2 minutes and then we start. Is
okay,
that
no problem.
Yep.
No problem.
recording that? So it's kind of your advice that actually helped the center to start some sort of a continuous monitoring program.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but yeah, we do have a lot of resource limitations, and I would love to hear from your study. How can we proceed? Because this is very early days for India's cyclone programs, as for the estuaries are concerned.
Okay.
And it's very early, the early days, and let's see that's how we can move forward in coming days.
Okay.
Yeah,
If you go
started accidentally.
Yeah. If you go to my website, under my email, there's a website there under my email address. Click on that. That's my website. And there are two monitoring programs that we discuss. If you go under research, it says ModMon and Ferrymon. Those are the two programs that I will be showing quite a bit of data from, on my presentation. But also, if people would like to discuss how we do the programs and what we do, I'd be more than glad to discuss that with anyone.
Yeah.
Where are you actually located physically?
Almost Calcutta. It is Calcutta.
Okay.
Just on the other side of the river, though, like the physical address called Howrah, but
okay.
like within 2 kilometers from Calcutta.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So I would rather say that we waited for 5 minutes. People have joined, and a few people have actually joined on YouTube. So we just keep on rolling the ball.
Okay.
And let's move on to it.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Myself is Saurav from Estuarine and Coastal Studies Foundation. I'm glad that all of you have joined to listen to legendary Professor Hans Pearl. Uh, Today's seminar is definitely on cyclone, but before the man behind cyclone, I would rather uh, like to introduce Professor Pearl to the audience. The audience here, as I can see, consists of professors, scientists, early career researchers, as well as many students. And all of you have either joined on Zoom platform, and some of you have joined on the YouTube platform. So Professor Pearl has done his PhD from University of California, 1973. He is currently a Kenan Distinguished Professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He works on coastal, estuarine, and freshwater ecosystems. As per the expertise is concerned, it's kind of biogeochemistry, algal bloom, human and climate impacts on water quality, and managing and protecting aquatic ecosystems. I think the last part of it is quite interesting because Professor Pearl is here. I would like to hear from him that's how this cyclone research arise in Nusi River estuary. But definitely that is something that this Indian audience would love to hear. I already told you that in India we are in the very early stage of cyclone research as per the estuaries are concerned. There were some scattered efforts from academics, but currently there are no government kind of endorsed or government kind of supported programs that are running for years. So from that note, we have a lot to develop. And from the foundation's end, I welcome you on behalf of all our members, all our well-wishers. Welcome to Estuarine and Coastal Studies Foundation. And stage is all yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I think you're going to play a recorded version of my talk in a minute.
Yes.
But I wanted to also stress that I grew up in California on the West Coast where we don't have any hurricanes or typhoons, although that's starting to change now too, and then moved to North Carolina, for my job back in 1978. So I was introduced to cyclones not until after I came to North Carolina and realized that I needed to include monitoring and assessment of these storms in addition to, regular water quality monitoring programs. So even in my case, I also had to evolve and change and adapt to the impacts that major storm events, including both tropical and extratropical cyclones, have on our coast. And of course, all that has increased dramatically in the last I would say in the last 2 decades. You'll see in my presentation that there's been an increase in these storms. So we're all adapting in one way or another. And so, don't feel like you're just a new kid on the block, because I was the new kid on the block a couple of decades ago. So my interests are in aquatic ecology, focusing on microbial processes and nutrient cycling, and eutrophication. That includes algal blooms, both in freshwater and marine systems. And most recently, I guess not really most recently, but over the years, I've developed a pretty strong interest in the connection between freshwater and marine systems, and which I call the continuum. Limnologists used to only address freshwater, marine biologists the marine side, but really we need to mesh both together because they're connected, and what happens upstream obviously affects the impacts in coastal zone. So I'll just stop there, and you can play the presentation, and then afterwards we can have a discussion.
Yep. Thank you, Professor Pearl. Then we shall go for the presentation, and you remain connected with us. And once the presentation is over, we can reconnect and start the discussion process, which rightly looking. I would love to
How do I
hear.
know? How do I know when to reconnect?
Well, you want to be on the backstage?
Yeah, I'll just stay in. You can just keep me connected.
Okay, then it's fine. Like then it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I just share the presentation. Yeah.
Hello there, I'm back. One more lecture here. And what we're going to talk about today is an issue that has been coming up with climate change, and that is the new normal of tropical cyclone or typhoon that are hitting our continents. And it's certainly a relevant topic with regard to North Carolina, but also China. And what I'm going to talk about is the implications for nutrient cycling and water quality in our waterways. And you can see here on the cover slide that there's a lot going on here with typhoons and hurricanes when they hit. Not only do they bring a lot of water, but also lots of nutrients and other contaminants. And we'll be talking about that and their fate in receiving waters and what that means in terms of nutrient cycling issues and budgets and overall water quality. So why are we concerned about tropical cyclones? Besides the obvious, that they cause a lot of destruction and many human sufferings. So they bring with them very large hydrologic perturbations, lots of water quickly, persistent flooding in low-lying areas, and that brings with it increased nutrients, organic matter, and contaminant inputs, and also changes in sediment dynamics, a lot more sediment coming down, deposited and resuspended. And you know, sediments kind of go hand in hand with nutrients, because the sediments that come in from these events, and you can see lots of good examples of that here, they bring with them nutrients. They're sort of the slow release nutrient fertilizer that's coming down with these storms. And then in terms of the organisms that live in the receiving waters, of course, there are tremendous impacts on habitat, water quality, food webs. And the reason we're concerned is that, as many publications now have indicated, we're in a period of elevated tropical cyclone activity, and it's not over. Looks like we're just in the sort of upward phase of that. You can see it here for the North Atlantic Basin, the data from NOAA showing increase in frequency of hurricanes, particularly major hurricanes as well. By the way, this is a picture of our house with a tree that got snapped, that almost fell on the house. It just was another tree that stopped it from falling on the house. And so we've had a lot of activity with having to bring in people to cut trees so that our house doesn't get damaged. Okay, so North Carolina is I call it a magnet for tropical cyclones. If you look at the number of cyclones we've had just since 1996, it's somewhere around 35 now, and increasing. And many of these are generated in the Atlantic and then come up the East Coast, and often they visit us. And this red arrow is basically where Beaufort is, where I live. So you can see we're sort of in the epicenter of hurricane tracks that come along. And typically the period when we get the most storms and hurricanes is in late summer, early fall. September is a very active month along our coast, but you can see they do occur in other months as well. For example, August and October here. And this is the strike zone of these storms. And you can see you know, we're a very active area in here, Florida, and then of course the Gulf Coast with New Orleans and Texas and Louisiana there. And what I'm going to focus on is recent major storms that we've had and floods, including major, really big storms, including Dennis and Floyd in '99, Ernesto, which was a tropical storm, Matthew, Florence, and most recently Dorian. And these ones that are starred are actually 200 to 500 year flood events. So we've had 1, 2, 3, 200 to 500 year flood events in the last 20 years, which, you know, tells us something that the climate is changing. Okay, so our coastal system, again, I live here in Beaufort. Our coastal system is dominated by a very large lagoonal estuary called the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound system. And you can see these rivers flowing into the system, emptying into here Albemarle Sound on the top, which is brackish, and then it flows into Pamlico Sound. And there's exchange with the coastal ocean going on in only a few places. Hatteras Inlet, Ocracoke Inlet, and then one down here. So this system is lagoonal. It has a fairly long residence time, and because of that, anything that gets into the system, like nutrients and contaminants, tend to stay there for quite a long time. And so this system shows a very high rapid response to any kind of nutrient inputs, because the nutrients, they don't just flush into the coastal ocean. They stay in the system and can be recycled and used many, many times again. So that makes this system very susceptible to eutrophication. There's a fine line there between high fertility that we like to have in here to support fisheries, but too much, which leads to these algal blooms and ultimately undesirable things like fish kills, for example, due to low oxygen. It's also the most important fishery in the southeast, in the US Southeast, and it drains, this whole system drains about half of North Carolina's coastal plain and also parts of Virginia. And in the watershed, we've had 50 years at least of agricultural and urban expansion, which has led to more nutrient inputs. So it's very susceptible to this eutrophication problem. And of course, it's been the site of increased frequency of tropical cyclones, and I count 36 in the last 25 years, with a lot of flooding associated with it. And you can see the increase here in storm activity that's been hitting us. Also the flooding here that's occurred in the coastal plain. So that would be this whole region in here that has periodically flooded. And you can see the sediment laden water here moving downstream. So one of the things we're very interested in is, of course, nutrients.
Yeah, good.
And what brings those nutrients into our estuarine environment. Of course, what brings it in is high water discharge and high hydrologic loading. And what I wanted to show you is just the discharge, the riverine discharge here of the Neuse River as it comes into the estuary. And you can see, what I've done is I've plotted several years, some years without storms like this one, and then some years where we've had typhoons in the fall. And you can see this period when they occur, usually starting in July, August, and then running all the way sometimes into November. And in years where we have these major storms, you can see the hydrograph, or the hydrologic loading. This is water discharge in terms of meters cubed per second. You can see when we have these major storms, they have huge impacts on water input into our estuarine system. In terms of nutrients, they bring in tremendous amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus as well. And again, here's the same type of plot, except you're looking at nitrogen loading now, in terms of kilograms of nitrogen per year or per day. And you can see when we have these storm events, there are lots of sources of nitrogen coming into our estuarine system. And in fact, in years where we have these storms, the nitrogen load can be like twice or even more than we would get in a normal year where we don't have any tropical cyclones. You can see there are periods of elevated nitrogen input in the spring, and that's a time when it's when we get some rainfall, when rainfall can be fairly high in the early spring period. And that's what I would call the normal loading of nitrogen. And then we have, abnormal, or it's getting to be more normal, impacts of major storm events. And it's true for phosphorus as well. And in years when we have these storms, for example, the influence of wet storms, these high discharge storms, they raise the total nitrogen load at least 13% over the baseline if you didn't have storms. And for phosphorus, it's even higher, 25, 26%. So these are very significant impact events in terms of loading of nutrients. We have, of course, the MODMON program in the Neuse estuary where we monitor every 2 weeks. And if you look at that data from the MODMON program, so this is like from upstream over in here to downstream to the entrance into Pamlico Sound, this would be sort of normal summer conditions. You see the fresh water coming in, leading to stratification with the salt water coming in from Pamlico Sound. And then after a major storm event, this would be after Hurricane Florence back in 2018, the system gets overwhelmed with freshwater input, overlaying the salt water that is still present in Pamlico Sound. And then here's temperature. Everything is uniform, of course, because you have this tremendous mixing. Dissolved oxygen, it actually is, it also is uniform, but it can decrease after some time with these storm events because of the organic matter that's consuming oxygen in the system. And of course, the algae are getting washed out into the sound. Here you can see an algal bloom during a normal sort of hydrologic situation, and here the everything is flushed into Pamlico Sound. So if you want to look at the algal growth response to these storms, don't look here. You have to look over here downstream because that's where all the discharge has led to. And so if we do look at phytoplankton or algae using chlorophyll A as the pigment indicator of algae, you can see that when we have these storm events, and I've just plotted 4 of them, you get spikes in chlorophyll afterwards, which are the phytoplankton response to the nutrients that have gotten into the system. There are also other spikes that we see, and those are related to other storm events and discharge events that have led to elevated chlorophyll and algal production. But the storms really have a very major impact on this. If we look at this with remote sensing, this is chlorophyll sensed from using CWIFS, which is used to be a satellite-based system. The satellite has since come down, but we have aircraft-mounted CWIFS, and CWIFS is a program that can tell us what the chlorophyll concentrations are by spectral absorbance. And here's the amounts of chlorophyll for the different colors. So when things are, purple to light, that means very light amounts of chlorophyll, almost no chlorophyll. Yellow and reds tell us where the algae are, where the blooms are. So when discharge is low, coming down the rivers, most of the production is going on upstream in the upper part of the estuary, and that's because the flow is relatively low, so that the algae can take advantage of the nutrient inputs without getting flushed out into the lower estuarine system, and most of the production is going on upstream in the system. Then when the flow increases, and that's this horizontal arrow, we get more water coming in, but also more nutrients, and that increases the algal production. Here it is coming down this way. And then when the flow is very high, our estuaries, they act like pipelines. They act like, a river, basically, where the flow is so high that the algal biomass cannot increase very rapidly, and most of the algae are getting flushed out into the Pamlico Sound. And you can see that the real response here with high flow is out here in Pamlico Sound and in the coastal ocean. And then when we go back to our moderate flow we sort of get a picture that's similar to this, with the production being based again up in the estuarine system. One thing that's important to point out here is that the nutrients really make a huge difference with this flow, because as you can see, when the flow is up, also more nutrients are being loaded into the system. You know, we can see that from this slide. With the high flow events, you're bringing in more nutrients too, and that's leading to more production. So, you know, it's a combined effect of hydrology and more nutrient inputs. Okay, if we have certain storm events, they can lead to moderate to heavy discharge coming into the estuary. And there are times when we have storms that don't completely flush the estuary, but they bring in enough new nutrients to start an algal bloom. And here we see the response to Tropical Storm Ernesto, which actually was a moderate rainfall event. And it set up a nutrient load and strong salinity stratification in the estuary. So, you know, it didn't completely flush the estuary, but it led to this very strong salinity stratification in the estuary. You can see it here looking at the salinity gradient. That led to favorable light and temperature conditions, ideal for an algal bloom. And you can see the algal bloom started right there where the salinity gradient existed in the estuary. And also high DO. This is dissolved oxygen that was produced by the algae. And this graph just shows you along the axis of the Neuse where the bloom actually occurred. It occurred right in here at this station 60 and 70. And that's where the estuary widens and where the residence time starts to increase. So the algae have figured out exactly where to bloom, where there's enough nutrients coming in, the residence time increases, the light's favorable, and in this case, we got a dinoflagellate bloom, and it turned out this dinoflagellate was toxic and caused all sorts of water quality problems. Here you can see the cells that we detected and the toxin production, and this led to a big fish kill along both sides of the estuary. So, you know, it all depends on how much water is moving down, how much nutrients are delivered, and how the hydrology matches up with the residence time of the receiving water body. So the next part of the talk is going to deal with some of these specific storm events, and I'll walk you through this. So back in 1999, we had 3 storm events in 6 weeks. Pretty amazing. And they were category 3. They were big hurricanes. Dennis, Floyd, and Irene, they occurred within 6 weeks. Record rainfalls associated with these storms fell in the basin of the Pamlico Sound. In here, this is Hurricane Dennis, by the way, to show you how large these storms are relative to the size of the United States. The record rainfalls that fell within a 12-hour period was equal to what we might get for a 100-year flood event. So really huge amounts of rainfall that ended up in the watershed. And when we look at nitrogen, the Pamlico Sound received the annual nitrogen load only within 1.5 months. So all the nitrogen that normally would be loaded in a year occurred in 1.5 months. These are really, really, really important big events. And here you can see the event using satellite remote imagery. Again, this is CWIF satellite. And this is before the storm hit. This is the Pamlico Sound system. Here's the Neuse estuary that we monitor. Here's Beaufort, where I live. And you can see this watershed, which is kind of flat, low-level watershed, just like in eastern China. And then after the storm, this is after Floyd, which was the second of those 3 storms. You can see all the organic matter and sediment that's washing down the rivers into Pamlico Sound, filling up the sound and actually overflowing the sound like a giant bathtub, so to speak. And this water then got advected, this high sediment water is advected out into the Atlantic Ocean by the Gulf Stream. We have the Gulf Stream coming by here transporting the sediment even offshore in the system. So really, really huge events. We had, like I said, we had 3 hurricanes within 6 weeks here in 1999. If we look at the salinity at this mid-sound station, you can see the salinity was somewhere between 15 and 20. Then we had the 3 storm events. Salinity went down to almost 0. And then it took almost a year for the salinity to come back up to what we would call normal. And, you know, that's just because this is a lagoonal system. It's like a big bathtub. You fill it up, and then you wait for the salt content to increase again as the water's evaporated out of the system. So these are very long-lasting events, even though the storm itself might be quite short. You know, the actual event, the recovery of the system took about a year or even longer. And if we look at chlorophyll, the algal growth response, so here you can see a bloom out here in the middle of the sound. Here are the spikes in chlorophyll that we saw afterwards, bloom events that lasted almost a year after the event itself. So initially, you know, the soluble nutrients were taken up, but then the sediment that came into the system supported additional blooms that went on for almost a year in the sound afterwards. So it's not all over really fast. We get very long-lasting impacts on our systems when we look at the algal growth response to the nutrients that have gotten in. One of the things that we're worried about is that not only do we get hurricanes, but they're increasing. And here you see all the major events that we've had going back to 1898 or 1889, I think, or 89, almost, you know, more than 100 years. So these are events, these dark ones, and then these are cyclones. So you see the number of cyclones have increased, but also the precipitation associated with these cyclones has increased. So not only are we getting more storms, but they're wetter as well, more rainfall associated with them. And as a result, of course, the discharge from our rivers into our estuarine systems has increased as well. And you can see it really well here. This is after Hurricane Florence in 2018, which was a little more south of, it made landfall over in here, just a little bit more south of Floyd. Let me just go back up so you can see the response from Floyd. Here's the response from Floyd, and you see there's not that much going on here. And that's because that storm came up here and moved up this way and released a lot of water and nutrients up in the upper part. But Florence, when it hit, it came down along the coast here. And then you see this tremendous influx of organic matter and sediments from this major storm event. So the issue is twofold. We're getting more storms, major storms, and the storms are carrying more water with them in terms of rainfall. And I think we're seeing the same thing in Asia along the Chinese and Japanese coast, particularly in Japan, where they had some really major flooding events from these increasing rainfall events associated with the storms. So the new normal then is more storms and more rainfall in these storms. You can see it here in terms of the organic matter that's being discharged from these major storm events, and nitrogen loading as nitrate. We're just getting more loads associated with these storms because there's more water carrying the nutrients and organic matter into our coastal systems. If we look at organic matter, this is the dissolved organic carbon associated with these storm events. You get a picture that looks very similar to nitrogen. This is the dissolved organic carbon load associated with these major hurricanes. And you see that a large, very large portion of the annual organic matter load is associated with these storms. Again, they're very significant in terms of impacting the coastal zone for organic matter. And if we have that, if we look at the percent increase over the baseline discharge, Dissolved organic carbon, more than a quarter of it can be associated with these storm events, and particulate organic carbon, about 20%. So again, the loads are tremendous from these storm events, both for nutrients as well as organic matter. If we look at riverine discharge concentrations of dissolved organic carbon following, in this case, Hurricane Matthew in 2016, you see that over time, we're looking at it starting in August. We actually had a fairly wet summer, and so there were pulses from rainfall events during the summer coming in. These are all the individual events that occurred. You can see the increases in discharge. Also the decrease in salinity, because you're getting more water, fresh water diluting the salinity in the estuary. And then here's the organic matter loading that's occurring with these storm events. Here's the baseline. Then we get into a wet summer, and you can see the organic matter loading goes up. Then we had a period of relatively low discharge, and you see the salinity goes up, the discharge is down, salinity is up. And then we get Hurricane Matthew, and you can see this tremendous pulse of organic matter, pretty much mirroring what we're seeing here coming into our estuarine systems. We've been doing some work looking at carbon to nitrogen ratios from these storm events, and you can definitely see that there are patterns in terms of the C to N ratio. And we're interested in this because we can identify potentially the sources of organic carbon based on C to N ratios. If the C to N ratio is low, that means that most of the production is probably going on in the estuary, okay? Relatively high nitrogen to carbon, because most of it is sitting in phytoplankton and living plants. And then we get a hurricane like Matthew, and all of a sudden the C to N ratio goes up. And that tells us that the DOC, in this case, appears to be terrestrial. That's the DOC is the open circles, and the POC appears to be a mix of both terrestrial and in-system sources, and that's the black. Those are the black circles. So you can use C to N ratios to look at these sources, and then if we look at the load here in terms of DOC relative to fluorescence absorbance in the system, you get a pretty good relationship. So that indicates that we can use this absorbance here, fluorescence absorbance, to tell us what the origin is and also how much of the DOC is coming into the system. This is a slide that's interesting, showing you the discharge from a storm event. So this is the water input, and here's the storm event, Hurricane Matthew. Again, this is in the Neuse River estuary. Here's a before and after picture. And then this is chlorophyll in the estuary based on MODMON data, the monitoring program data. So this is upstream, up in here. This would be the entrance to Pamlico Sound. And you can see we had quite a few algal blooms in the system. Then Hurricane Matthew came along. It flushed out the system. So no phytoplankton could grow with that high flushing rate, okay? And here's the organic matter, the DOC, associated with that storm event. And then when things slowed down, when the discharge slowed down and the residence time increased, the phytoplankton came back and we got continued blooms in the system. So this shows you sort of the dynamics of organic matter that goes on when you get a storm event. It completely switches from phytoplankton production in the system, at least initially, to organic matter that's coming from the watershed. But the phytoplankton do come back because, you know, you've had this nutrient discharge that's gone on with the storm event at the same time, delivering nutrients, and then when the flow goes down and the residence time increases, the phytoplankton increases as well. So pretty neat data showing you how well you can use these monitoring programs to look at how much production you get and how much organic matter is coming into the system. Okay, so if we then look at the distribution of organic matter that's in the system, and that's been determined by looking at C to N ratios, as well as some N15 measurements on and carbon-13 measurements on the organic matter. Here we see what the distribution is of organic matter in the estuary before the hurricane. So river organic matter is the green box. Wetlands associated with the side of the river is the brown box, and then ocean influence is the blue box. So then we get the hurricane, and all of a sudden you see the brown box starting to come up, and that's the flushing of organic matter from the wetland into the river. That's all of a sudden dominating the organic matter. This is the upstream riverine part, which is actually lower than the wetlands, and here's the ocean effect. So the wetlands along the side of the river are really important sources of nutrients and organic matter coming into the system. And then once we wade out the effect, you see the river comes back as the dominant source. The wetlands, which no longer have a lot of flushing associated with them, decrease as the role and importance in the system. Then we had some additional rainfall events, and the wetlands increased again as a source of organic matter. So we have these very nice techniques that tell us where these sources are coming from. So if we look at the DOC mass loading from the Neuse River and the freshwater wetlands coming into the river in Pamlico Sound, you can see that the fraction that's associated with wetlands is quite high relative to the river and the ocean. In Pamlico Sound, so this is the Neuse River, in Pamlico Sound, it's also really important as well. So wetlands are a really important part of the loading when they get overwhelmed by these flood events coming into our rivers and coastal ocean. The other question we wanted to ask was how long does it take for the organic matter concentrations to return back to a baseline after we've had an event? And this is work we've done with Eero Asmala, who's a Finnish graduate student who worked with us on this. And we see here you see the DOC loading from the different storm events, which I already showed you. And then here is the distribution of the DOC along the, in terms of days after the storm event. So here, you know, the storm hits, and you can see where in this, where in the estuarine locations, where it comes back to the baseline. And upstream, this is the upstream station here. So this would be way up in here. Upstream, it comes back pretty quickly, but downstream, there's a residual effect. And you can see that as you get down near the mouth here, there's still a lot of organic matter that has come into the system. And as we go further downstream, you see that the recovery time is longer. So what this means is that this organic matter, to some extent, even though it does bypass the estuarine system, a lot of it is actually caught in the system. And we think that over time, this sort of long recovery leads to sediments that then can release their nutrients back into the water column before it exits into the coastal ocean. So there is kind of a relay or delay kind of effect with these storm events. We've been using various techniques to look at where the organic matter is coming from that's coming into our coastal zone. And again, I can make publications available to you if you're interested, using fluorescence techniques. And let me just go to the next slide. What we can do is we can actually look at the emission of fluorescence relative to the excitation for different samples that we've collected. And what you can see is that each source, for example, humic-like microbial material, fulvic acid, protein sources, etc., they all have different signatures if we compare the emission relative to the excitation. So this method called EM-Herafac, and it's in this paper here. So again, I can send that to you to read up on it. That method can be used to separate the different organic matter classes. And then we can track these different organic matter classes through the estuary to see if they're either produced or used by microbes during their transit through the estuary. The other thing is that we can link these particular sources back up into the watershed to the sources that are producing these types of organic matter. And from that, we've been able to create these pie-shaped graphs that show us where the organic matter is coming from in an urbanized watershed versus an agricultural watershed. So we're starting to really make a lot of progress in terms of understanding where the organic matter comes from that's released during these major storm events. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was carbon dioxide, CO2 dynamics, because that's another really important part of the story. And I had a graduate student, Jamie Croswell, who did his PhD on that particular part of the sort of carbon story of hurricanes. And he was interested in looking at carbon dioxide, you know, coming in and out of the system during these storm events. So he looked at one particular storm, Hurricane Irene, which hit the coast in 2011. And you can see some of the major storm damage that occurred during this event. And this event went all the way up the East Coast. It hit us, but also did a lot of damage upstream in other parts of the system. Here's the track again, Irene coming up. And you can see it just went right over us. We live right here. We're like a magnet for these storms. Lots of houses got washed away into the ocean from the storm event. Here's our docks. We have a community dock. Before and during and afterwards it disappeared because the whole thing got washed into the ocean. We had sustained winds for a long time, over 200 millimeters of rainfall, a storm surge of 3 to 4 meters in Albemarle Pamlico Sound, and you can see the high water here from that event. Joey used a flow-through system for determining PCO2, the saturation of CO2 in the water, and we were able to mount that on a boat to do our transects for ModMon. Okay, and I'm not going to tell you all the details about this because I know very little about it, but from this he can calculate the PCO2 flux, how much CO2 is coming into the system versus how much CO2 is coming out. And what he determined was that during the storm event, of course, there's short-term effects of high winds, and then post-storm, of course, the winds decrease. But what he looked at was air-water CO2 transport. So this would be CO2 coming in, CO2 released, and of course, before the storm, there's a lot of CO2 being taken up because it's being taken up by plants and photosynthesis on a net basis, both in the Neuse River estuary and Pamlico Sound. And then we get the hurricane. And then during the hurricane, there's a lot of release going on because the water is being whipped up and you're getting a lot of CO2 that's being exported out of the system back up into the air. Also, organic matter that's being washed into the system is being decomposed and converted to CO2. So there's a lot of CO2 flux out of these systems right during and after the hurricane event. Before that, most of the uptake makes the net CO2 flux into the system. Okay, so these storm events are very important in terms of CO2 transport out. And if we look at this over time, this is in the Neuse River estuary and also another estuary close by, the New River estuary, looking at it for different storm events relative to non-storm events. When we don't have any storm events, we see net uptake of CO2. This is the zero line here. So anything below it would indicate uptake of CO2, and above it, release of CO2 into the atmosphere. And you can see these storm events are major sources of CO2 leaving the system, going back up into the atmosphere. So the take-home message here is that one tropical cyclone, in this case Isabel, can liberate as much CO2 as what's actually fixed by the phytoplankton in 1 year. So these are really major perturbations to the CO2 cycle. And as we get more storms, we're going to have more CO2 being lost to the air. And we'll get back to this in a minute. Whereas if we have calm conditions, most of the CO2 is taken back up into the system. But one event can lead to tremendous amounts of CO2 being emitted back up into the atmosphere. So here's how it works. You know, we get the hurricane coming along. This is before the storm event. Relatively low discharge. The phytoplankton are blooming at the upper part of the estuary. Most of the carbon dioxide is being taken up by photosynthesis in the system. Okay. Then during the storm, we have a lot of water being discharged. The phytoplankton are being washed out of the system into the sound. A lot of CO2 being emitted in the air because it's not being taken up by the algae. They're not around. And the organic matter that's being put into the system is being metabolized and leading to more CO2 being released. And then after the storm event, there's still CO2 being released because you're still getting residual organic matter being loaded into the system. But the flow rate, the discharge rate is going down, and that allows the phytoplankton to come back essentially and reestablish themselves. So we're getting some CO2 uptake, but still there's a lot of CO2 discharge going back up into the atmosphere. So the global implications are obvious. More intense hurricanes are going to lead to more biomass loss from the watershed into the coastal zone. That's going to lead to more CO2 being generated up into the air. And this remobilized carbon is accumulated in wetlands over decades and centuries, and all of a sudden a storm comes along and emits the CO2 back up into the air, back in significant storm events. So the really worrisome thing about all this is that more intense storms lead to more carbon mobilization, more carbon being lost from the watershed into the coastal waters. That leads to more CO2 released. And we know that CO2 buildup in the atmosphere is leading to warming, and that warming is leading to more intense storms. So this is kind of a worrisome feedback. You know, we have more intense storms that are leading to more carbon being mobilized, more CO2, more storms. Where is this all going to end? We don't really know. There's this big feedback here then between more storms leading to more CO2 being emitted into the air, leading to more storms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not only going on here, it's also going on the eastern margin of Asia, and to some extent in other places like Australia and India. So this has huge global implications for carbon cycling. And from an ecological perspective, these hurricanes are problematic, particularly if they're increased in frequency, because if we have a hurricane that comes along, it's going to take a while for the ecosystem to respond and come back to normal from these hurricanes, as I showed you for Pamlico Sound. But what if we get another hurricane that hits when the system is trying to get back to normal? And that seems to be what we're really getting into now, is we're getting this instability in ecosystem state. If we have this increased frequency of perturbations, it's not allowing the systems to recover quickly enough to overcome the damaging effect of a hurricane. And so this probably has very big ramifications for resources that we get from these systems, fisheries, use of these waters for everything, recreational use. We're getting more algal blooms in between these events, and it's very leading to the sort of continuous instability of the of the systems that have to deal with these ecological effects of the storms. So summing it all up, so the implications and what can we do to best manage our watersheds in these big storm events. We know storms deliver more nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon, and the loads are very significant, particularly in relation to annual loads. This is promoting more algal blooms, more hypoxia, more fish kills, and habitat decline. And we know that terrestrial and wetlands can dominate the carbon loading during these events. So they're being flushed out and washed out into the coastal waters. Storms significantly impact the air-water carbon exchange, CO2. CO2 outgassing during storm years can account for very large percentages of what's actually fixed. And we think there may be a positive feedback here with climate change. So, more CO2 coming out, driving more storms that are leading to more CO2 coming out. This is a really worrisome positive feedback that's going on. So really, to sum that all up, we're experiencing a new normal in tropical cyclone frequency, rainfall intensity, and flooding. And that's all being driven by ocean warming and to some extent sea level rise, which is impacting all of these processes. So what can we do about it? Well, our main strategy is to retain nutrients on land and organic matter as well by enhancing riparian buffers, no-till agriculture, stormwater retention systems, and timely applications of fertilizers so that we don't apply fertilizers, a month before we get into the storm season, for example. We also need to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, and oxides of nitrogen. So as we improve air quality, we may also be improving the emissions of greenhouse gases. So there's a double benefit from improving air quality, and that certainly applies to China as well. And more immediate needs are tools to really evaluate how the system is responding and where we have sensitive systems in response to these events. So remote sensing is important, and really good continuous water quality monitoring to capture these events over relative scales, and then lastly, adaptive nutrient management in response to these climatic changes and extremes. So with that, I'll stop this lecture, and I want to first of all thank again our funding agencies that have been really useful in supporting this kind of work, and just leave you with kind of a conceptual diagram showing you how we're using monitoring to best look at the responses of these storm events as they impact our coastal systems, going from the rivers on into the coastal ocean.
Hello. Yep. So we did hear the lecture, and it was pretty scary in one end, and there's lots to learn, considering that we are in the very beginning of trying to set up a program for India. And as I was discussing with you, that we are kind of a new kid now today. We started our programs only with a dinghy, and chasing planktons and pure water quality, far away from the continuous monitoring of science. But it was really something to open the vision. Thank you for that. Thank you, Professor Pearl, to just let us know like the dimensionality of the problems and different dimensions that could be studied by researchers, students, scientists, the professors. I would rather now open the floor to have a sort of a discussion and question answer if there is any. So can we the the participants, they can, if they have a question, then you are ready to feel free to ask to Professor Paul, and then we fuel the discussion in that way. Anybody from the floor?
Can I just make a comment? Obviously it was not easy to see the presentation. It was out of focus, but I would be more than glad to send anyone a copy of this recording by Dropbox. So, which is a good way of sending a large file. So if anyone would like a clear copy of it, I know it was very frustrating to see, you couldn't see the writing very well on there. I would be more than glad to send that to you. Just send me your email and request, and I will send you the presentation by Dropbox.
Thank you. Yes, that was a complaint that we received from multiple viewers, both on YouTube and on Zoom platform. I think it has something to do with the technicality that's we scientists may not be good for handling it.
Certainly not me.
Now it's anyway. It's the floor is open for interaction, and anybody from the audience, if you want to have a question to Professor Paul, please go ahead. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, if you have a question for Professor Paul,
raise your hand. You can do that on the screen by just going to reactions, and it allows you to raise your hand, and that way the host can see who's asking the question. I see one.
I see one. Yeah. Go ahead, Tanay. Like you can have a conversation start.
Hello, Professor Paul. Thank you for that a beautiful presentation. However, I've not been able to see most of that clearly, but I think a copy of that to the ACSF director will help. Am I audible?
Excuse me?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. So my question...
Speak slowly.
Okay. So my question to Professor Pearl is that you have shown some of the pictures of remote sensing from before and after the hurricane hit the land or the landmass. So one of the problems that we generally face regarding the satellite image is the cloud cover. The cloud cover during the event. So what type of span you generally took when you try to analyze the post tsunami or post hurricane images? So for example, are you using SAR images or LiDAR images to penetrate the cloud, or you are using different types of band combination which are readily available or freely available?
Yeah, well, I'm not a remote sensing expert, but the pictures I showed were ones that were that took place, a week or so beforehand on a clear day. Okay. And then afterwards also, when the clouds lifted. So, I think it is very difficult to get immediate effects if the clouds stick around. But you would probably have to consult with a remote sensing person to figure out what system is going to be best to get the optimal image. And of course, there's also aircraft remote sensing, which in the case of Pamlico Sound, a lot of the remote sensing we do is by aircraft. They're just either high flying aircraft or drones. So there are different ways of getting around that problem. It all depends on how large the field is that you want to look at. If it's a relatively small system, then probably aircraft remote sensing might be the best.
Yes, I agree with you that in that particular note, that if you have aircraft or drone with SAR sensor or the LiDAR sensor, it will definitely help and able to penetrate the cloud. But yes, that kind of data, that's I'm asking you, that kind of data may be not available freely to analyze if someone is doing in another area, for example, in Sundarbans or in other coastal areas. So the freely data is not available. So if the range is small, so then drone and the aircraft may be the best solution in those scenarios.
Tanoa, you can send me an email with your question, and then I can get you in contact with someone, some of the experts that we collaborate with from EPA and from NOAA.
Okay, thank you.
Now you'll need to lower your hand, and so we can see if someone else has a question.
Hello, Professor Pearl.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I want to ask you, is there any particular recovery time that after this kind of phenomenon the system gets recovered? Is there any particular recovery time for the system, or can we calculate the recovery time that it is getting to its natural state after this kind of cyclone or typhoon?
Yeah, the biggest factor there is how much rainfall has occurred with the event. If it's a high wind event and not much rainfall, the recovery tends to be fairly fast, within weeks. But when we have very extensive rainfall that impacts a large proportion of the watershed, like the hurricanes I showed in 1999, the effects lasted. Those storms came in September. I think September into early October. The system was still going through the nutrient release from the sediments that came in the following spring and summer. So we actually had an algal bloom 9 months later, simply because there was the sediments that got washed into the system were still releasing nutrients. So, the effects can last anywhere from, I don't know, I would say a weeks to definitely several months, if not a year or later, depending on how much rainfall occurs and how much of the watershed is affected.
Yeah, actually, in our system, we work in Indian Sundarbans and the Ganges system. What we have found that after a cyclone or a severe cyclone, it takes days to months to recover the system as it was. So I think we cannot quantify this, right? For this kind of cyclone, the recovery rate is this. We can't quantify that, right?
Yes, I think it's highly variable depending on hydrology. And also, one thing is that some aspects of the ecosystem may not recover at all. For example, if you're losing a lot of seagrasses and benthic flora, you may end up losing a very important part of the ecosystem that is important for fauna that live in seagrass meadows, for example, and higher fauna that are feeding off of them. And we've seen that in here in the U.S. We've seen that in places like Florida, which gets impacted by tropical cyclones a lot, and also in our system, in the Albemarle Pamlico Sound system, the turbidity can remain quite high after one of these major storm events because they're shallow. The sediments are, resuspending all the time in the system with wind, and that might actually take away the benthic, the submerged aquatic vegetation, which is a really big problem that we're having with the increased storms. The plankton, the phytoplankton, they recover pretty quickly because, they're in the upper water column cycling around, but the stuff that is attached to the bottom, which does require quite a bit of light, can be severely impacted. And we've now seen areas along North Carolina's coastline that appear to be permanently changed because of that.
Yeah. In case of plankton, we have studied the zooplankton during the different cyclones in our Ganges system. Yeah, it is true what you have said, that it takes a very short time, from a few days to a few weeks, it comes to the system again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
It may
Thank you
change
very
though
much.
in composition.
Yeah.
The phytoplankton might change in composition though, because
It changes.
Yeah. the faster growing groups tend to come back the earliest, like diatoms and green algae, for example.
Yes. Thank you very much.
I see that Dr. Joyita Mukherjee has a question floated on chat. Joyita, would you love to talk directly to Professor Paul, or shall I direct your question?
I can read it. I'm curious if your team has done any work on the effects of cyclone upon ocean acidification. Really good question. We've actually been working together with researchers in Chesapeake Bay, which is, north of us, and it's the largest estuary. We're the second largest estuary, but we both have long-term monitoring programs in place, and we've been looking at those, and it turns out that the impacts can actually go all the way from acidification to basification. So, it depends on the sources of organic matter that are coming out of the watershed, which can affect pH very strongly. And then also the productivity response in the system. So, the watershed might give up quite a bit of organic matter, which would lead to acidification because of it's being decomposed. But then the nutrients that are coming in from the storm may stimulate phytoplankton production and eutrophication, which would drive the pH up. And we've actually seen both of these phenomena in Chesapeake Bay and in the Albemarle Pamlico Sound system. So I think we need to think about it not just as acidification, but also as basification. And one more comment about the acidification question. It's much easier to hypothesize acidification in the open ocean because the nutrients come in and you get the productivity response without much impact from the watershed. But when we get close into the estuaries, it can go both ways. So I think this term ocean acidification doesn't necessarily apply to estuarine systems. The pH can change upward. And we have a paper that's been submitted. It's in review right now with Limnology and Oceanography. It should be coming out pretty soon. It got good reviews, but the lead author's not so fast. So we're having to wait until he gets that published. But the answer to your question is it can go both ways.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Your findings of your recent work is quite interesting because we get most of the literature about ocean acidification that is related to such kind of perturbation to the aquatic system, but it is quite interesting that it is actually basification here. So actually, it is as you said that it is very different in open ocean and in estuarine system. So in our Bay of Bengal, that is the mouth of river Ganges, in that estuarine system where I work on the estuarine system. So I think it could have we could have seen such a similar type of work, because I don't know, I think nobody is working on this area here right now, so maybe it is quite interesting to look into these things also in our estuarine system. And I'm also interested to know that what you were saying, that you have worked in many different aquatic systems. So have you seen any kind of influence of mangroves? Because cyclones are actually, there are a lot of effects of on mangroves. Mangroves actually help to prevent the cyclones and to make the system resilient enough. So what in the systems where you have worked, are those systems with mangroves or without mangroves?
We are too far north. The mangroves,
Okay.
the mangroves stop just above Florida, and of course we're further north. So we don't, our main vegetation would be seagrasses and marsh grasses. And they do have an impact, obviously, because they are photosynthetic. They will affect pH, and they also physically would buffer against some of the disturbances from tropical storms and hurricanes. But, relative to mangroves, probably minor effect.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
I would
Thank you.
suggest if you have Google, you should look up Florida, because I think there's been quite a bit of work done in Florida on impacts on mangroves, but also protective roles of mangroves.
Okay. And have you ever checked on any phenomenon like the oxygen depletion with these cyclonic events or anything else?
Yes, we can get. I didn't really. Well, the one graph that showed that was very unclear because it was not very focused. But we can get pretty severe oxygen depletion after major storms, particularly if they impact a lot of carbon export from the watershed into our estuaries. And even in shallow estuaries, we can get severe oxygen depletion following a major storm event. So yes, the impacts can be quite severe, and of course that would impact the fauna, particularly animals that can't move, like oysters and clams and benthic. And we've had some pretty severe negative impacts on oysters, on scallops, and clams. Whereas, interestingly enough, crabs are not as severely impacted because they can get away from the low oxygen water and crawl up around the edge of the estuary. They've adapted sort of to these major low oxygen events.
Okay, so quite interesting results. So looking forward to read your publication that you mentioned earlier. So thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank Professor Pearl. I have a question coming from YouTube. It is from Dr. Saugata Raichaudhuri. He says that to the increased frequency of tropical cyclones impact on the recovery of coastal ecosystems, especially estuaries.
Definitely. I mean, the answer is yes. The increasing frequency of tropical cyclones is having both short-term and long-term impacts on our estuarine coastal ecosystems, particularly if they are already disturbed by human activity like overfishing, trawling, bottom disturbance, stuff like that. Yes. And I think it's increasing globally. I think this problem, not just.
I would, if you allow me, then I would like to add a few things here.
Sure.
Yeah. So to answer this question, we had studied the Ganges system for last, I would say, from 2019 to 2021, and we have chased down a few cyclones starting from category 2 to category 5, even Amphan. Like, do you think that it is the place of impact is more important rather than the category, and the phenomena that's, since Ganges is a huge volume of water that hardly stands still, we find this disruptions to be very I would say temporary, lasting for few weeks to few months, and this is one of my surprise. That's if we look at the data, say for the zooplankton data of Ganges, you may have in a normal day, you go out in Ganges and you can catch around like 30 to 35 species of copypods. I'm just narrowing it down. And then say a cyclone happens, a tropical cyclone happens, and 1 week after you get around like it starts very slowly, it builds up, and by like 1 week or 10 days after the cyclone hits, it's almost 50% recovered. And that what is most important here, like we have seen this trend irrespective of the category of cyclone that is passing through the stage, through the section of the Ganges. Suppose a cyclone has happened like 100 kilometers away from Calcutta, and by that time it has passed the that section of Ganges. It's only a category 1 or a major depression, and then again say some which has happened almost next to the estuary mouth, a category 3 cyclone, but the response in terms of the zooplankton especially isn't that very much contrasting, which puzzles me a lot. And I think I have read it. I acknowledge that when we start this program in 2019, I was reading a lot of papers of yours, which helps me to formulate the designs and the study. Well, as you can understand that we do not have the facility for continuous monitoring. So what we do is a kind of a pre-study, which is possibly monthly frequency. Once the cyclone hits, once the red alert is lifted, we then go for daily sampling for a week or so, and then we start the expand the frequency, like one sampling in 3 days, one sampling in 5 days, one sampling in 15 days, and then merge it again with the monthly sampling. But this is something very interesting came up when it comes to the zooplankton. At least from our data, we never found that that particular category of cyclone is like expanding the recovery time. Do you have any and this is particularly for the Ganges where the water is always flowing?
Yeah.
Do you have any insights for that sort of finding?
Well, we don't have any large rivers like the Ganges coming in to our coastal system. They're fairly small rivers. They do flood very easily. So I would say, in agreement with what you're concluding, that the category sometimes is not as important as the actual amount of hydrology, how the hydrology is really affected in the system. But with the Ganges being such a huge river, the Well, again, it depends on where the rain is falling, in the system, and how much organic matter it's really and nutrients it's really bringing in to the coastal environment. I would imagine that with the Ganges, it's going to be buffered by the large river flow, but there could be events that would overcome what you would normally see. And one thing about the zooplankton is that, the zooplankton are eating quite diverse sources of food. So even though there may be changes that you're seeing in the phytoplankton, the zooplankton may actually be more opportunistic in terms of coming back and, increasing their biomass. And of course, they are also impacted by residence time, just like the phytoplankton. So it might be interesting if you can calculate residence time and relate that to what you're seeing in the zooplankton community. This is something we've been working on a lot with phytoplankton. They're very sensitive to residence time because, if the residence time is short, the phytoplankton simply cannot outgrow the rate at which they're being flushed out of the system. And I think the same is true with zooplankton. But the zooplankton are pretty, many of the zooplankton species are pretty opportunistic in terms of what they're eating. But I agree with
And
you.
there is well-marked signature that even among those copypods or this a group of zooplankton, those which are kind of omnivorous, mostly opportunistic and can thrive in variable pH and all these sort of things, like they kind of start to colonize and they remain literally unaffected. I would say that their dominance and their reign literally remains unaffected compared to those like a marginalized one which gets pushed out and then they take long time to claw back. Another question that is coming up from a student is on chat box, and she's asking about dolphin behavior. She studies dolphin in Ganges.
Yeah.
And she's asking that if there is any impact on big mammals.
This is way out of my area of expertise. But I think the main, and this is just speculation, I think the main impact on higher trophic levels, particularly top predators or top carnivores like dolphins, is going to be food supply. I think they're always looking for food, so that's one issue. If the impacts on fish at the lower trophic levels is severe, and that can happen, particularly with diseases and stress that occur on fish and fish kills and low oxygen events, then I think you're going to see the dolphins follow, go somewhere else, because they're very smart. They know how to, they know when it's not hospitable, the environment. I mean, we see that here just locally, that after a hurricane, a tropical storm, the dolphins just don't come in to feed. They stay offshore.
I think the low oxygen and the mechanical displacement of the critters, kind of like a fish or that could be one of the reason that dolphins apparently shift their distribution. I'm not very sure about their behavior though. Maybe.
No, I'm only judging by what I observe when I'm in my boat and go fishing.
and there is another question from Dr. Avik Chowdhury. He has a question: does differences? Can you kindly?
Oh yeah, I see the question. Does differences in residence time of individual phytoplankton taxon affect the recovery time? Yes, very much so. For example, and I didn't show this slide because, I had too many slides to begin with anyway, but we've done work with looking at phytoplankton taxa using diagnostic pigments, that we examine by high performance liquid chromatography. And typically what you see after a major hurricane that freshens up the system and also reduces the residence time is that green algae, chlorophytes, become dominant very quickly, and also diatoms. Whereas the slower growing taxa like dinoflagellates and cyanobacteria, they don't do well until the residence time starts to increase again, and then they become more competitive. So the answer to that question is definitely yes. And there's some really good papers that discuss this. I think you have my curriculum. Did I send you my curriculum vitae? There's a paper by Ben Parles. His last name is spelled Peierls. I think the paper was published somewhere around 2014 or something, discussing this very issue, how changes in residence time impact the phytoplankton composition and biomass. And also papers by Nathan Hall around 2014. It's in my CV.
Yeah, I can forward that to the forward the CV to the participants so that they can extract the papers. That's
Okay.
more likely. Yeah.
And if they have more specific questions, they can just email me, and I can see if I can send them papers that address those issues.
So I see any further questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, I am Dr. Raut from Calcutta University.
Okay.
I have one just interesting point to learn from your experience. That is, we cannot control the frequency of cyclone, really, but we want to get benefit during post-cyclonic period. So what should be our strategy to get more benefit from the coastal and estuarine ecosystem during post-cyclonic or typhonic period?
I'm not quite sure if I understand your question. I think, are you talking about resources like fisheries and things like that?
Yeah. That is
one
activity for our benefit, for human benefit.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that we see in North Carolina is that some of the fisheries are depressed for quite some time after cyclones, particularly fish that are benthic or depend on benthic food. But also the big changes in salinity that we see in our estuaries. And so those fisheries become depressed. They become very sensitive to overfishing. And our fisheries management people have learned that certain fish species that have those specific habitat requirements or food sources need to be protected and not fished during, after major storm events that change the system. And also with shellfish like crabs, for example, and certainly shellfish that lives on the bottom. So I don't see much of a benefit, at least not in the short term, from tropical cyclones with regard to fisheries. I think there could be benefits in the long run, but those will depend on how the productivity of the system responds and how amenable the water column is to fisheries to begin with, like low oxygen events, for example.
Okay, thank you.
We've had after after the 3 storms we had in 1999, the state closed its fishing on crabs and benthic, benthic, basically benthic fauna like oysters and clams for several years, simply to protect it and allow it to become reestablished.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chef.
So, any more questions?
Yeah, Saurabh, I have a question. Thank you, Professor Pal, for such a nice talk. I have already written it in the chat box. Probably you have missed it. As Professor Pal, I have a question. As we know that cyclones could generate very high waves and sometimes rough undercurrent and heavy rain after cyclones. So how all
Excuse me? I don't think I understood your question. Maybe speak quite slow.
There is a message like, as we know, cyclones could generate high waves and rough undercurrents. How the habitats of slow-moving animals like small fish, turtles, and shellfishes are affected.
Well, they're definitely affected, but I think they're actually more affected by things like low oxygen and major biogeochemical changes in the system. I think a lot of the fauna, they're used to, high turbulence and high wind mixing, because that occurs even when we don't have cyclones. So really the major impacts on fisheries that we see are major habitat changes, like low oxygen, for example, high input of organic matter, which can also stress fish. And often we see fish that are stressed by having sores on them or lesions that are caused by opportunistic microorganisms because the fish are stressed. And the major stressor tends to be low oxygen. And also one other thing that impacts fisheries in our system is the input of things like pesticides from the watershed that get flushed into the system and can have very deleterious impacts on invertebrates and even fish. Things like insecticides, for example, that end up getting flushed from the watershed into receiving waters.
So,
okay, thank you.
anyone have any more questions? Okay, if not, I would like to ask, rather, it's not a question, kind of a suggestion, Professor Pal. As we are developing an estuarine program for India, and we have taken Ganges as a model, so somewhere people have to start, and most of the papers that we get around the world, well, there are not many papers, definitely. We get yours, we get few from Taiwan, we get a few from the Florida, California.
How about Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then definitely we get a few from India. But as I said, like this whole research regarding the cyclone is kind of a new normal for India, because it started with a tsunami program, because in 2000 it was a big tsunami that killed a lot of people, and as a result of that, we have started monitoring our coasts, and then these sort of papers started flourishing. I would say still, like, the number of papers in any sort of journals is less than 20. So and apart and among them, like you will get half of them is actually from in around Calcutta, Indian Sundarbans, and Ganges system. So that's why what we have done, we have taken Ganges as a model system, and as a result, so we are trying to put some measures for continuous measurements. Well, the installation of infrastructures for us is difficult. It's not because there are different hazards which are beyond the control of scientists, I would rather say. So do you set any optimal frequency for studying cyclones and cyclone related changes in water quality, be it biogeochemistry or the plankton or fish, any sort of frequency that with which cyclones could be studied for longer period of time, one after another? Because well, I think the question is not personal, but to be honest, like when we write some papers from India and we do it from our own minimal resources, so the question that comes up is that, well, your model is not adequate enough to explain a cyclone, right? So
Explain the effects. You mean explain the effects of a cyclone?
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But what we can do, we can live with the resources that we have. So is there any optimal frequency for the biogeochemical cycling or the plankton, at least the lower food weight and the water quality that you are studying for years? That I know that you possibly have the facilities to study them per week for a long period of time, but for in a country like India, this is just unimaginable.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice on that?
Yes. Well, I can tell you a little bit about our experience. And, we're not, I wouldn't say we have all the resources that we need to adequately monitor something. Often, we want to go out every day because we see changes in phytoplankton, for example, which can occur very quickly. But I think our experience has been that sampling biweekly, every 2 weeks, is a really good strategy during the major phytoplankton growth period. So the way we've set things up with our monitoring program with ModMon, and you can see that again on my website, every 2 weeks from March through October, and then monthly from October back to March. And that really has to do with, the seasonality and when we have our primary productivity annual cycle, basically. So biweekly is pretty good. And then, if there is a major event, well, then we do what's called opportunistic sampling. If we have the resources, go out a couple of days after the hurricane when it's safe to go out and add that to your database. But biweekly is pretty good for a system our size. And also Chesapeake Bay program, you might want to look at that. I think they go out biweekly to monthly as well. It's a bigger program. I think that most of their stations are monthly, but I think if you can do a biweekly monitoring program, I think that's real optimal. And then, of course, there are continuous monitoring capabilities. Vertical profilers that are commercially available now, and also taking advantage of ferries and ships. You probably have quite a few ferries that go across the Ganges system where it comes, making agreements with the ferry operators so that, someone can go on board to sample
Yeah.
Or in our case, we actually have the sampling gear on the ferries already. But, you know, that takes quite a bit of, it takes quite a bit of engineering, and also the maintenance can be quite, you know, quite complicated. So I wouldn't recommend, I think just sampling off the ferries is probably a good idea if you can have the ferry operator agree, you know, to doing that.
Well, currently our program, the foundations program for Cyclone is running for 3 years now, 3 years on a row. And it's monthly. And if there is an event, definitely we follow kind of a cyclone chaser.
Yeah.
We do a like a just before hit sample, and then we follow it up once the things are kind of calm down, like after 2 days or 3 days when the roads are open or something like that.
Okay.
We then go out for sampling, and that would be for a few days, like a week or two, and then we run out of our money. That's so we cannot we cannot continue.
Yeah, no, I understand. We have similar problems.
Yeah, that's, and another question that I think a few have joined from completely student perspective. I think they are shy. There are quite a young people around. They if they want to be a cyclone chaser, or they want to be a cyclone scientist in future, be it at United States, be it in India, looking for higher education opportunities in this domain, what would be your advice to them? And like, what could be the process, maybe to join your team, maybe to join other good teams doing the research work, or how they could start in India also?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm going to be retiring pretty soon. You know, I've been in this business for a long time, so I've been actually turning down students that want to do a PhD with me because I think I'll be retired before they're done. But I would look at places like Florida, the Gulf, U.S. Gulf. Louisiana State University has a big program, you know, in that area. University of Miami in Florida, in the Chesapeake Bay area, University of Maryland, University of Virginia, and then, of course, here in North Carolina, we have both UNC and NC State and Duke University. They all, you know, they're all sort of out there trying to figure out the kinds of questions that that you all have been asking, basically. You know, how frequently do we sample? What do we sample? What's the best infrastructure to follow, and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, I would definitely focus in on contacting university and agency labs along the East Coast in the U.S., Florida, and the Gulf Coast states. And if anyone has a question about that and they are interested in some particular place, they can send me an email and I might be able to give them some suggestions.
Thank you. Any final question to Professor from the audience? Any final question?
Well, if you get if something comes to mind later on, just send me an email.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for being with us and for the conversation dragged on. It's exclusive and Indian audience. So we say namaste from our side. And with that note, we are closing down today, but we will be in touch with you as we develop more and more facets of our cyclone program, for not only for the foundation, not only for a few PI, but this is kind of an initiation for the country. We are doing it for the Ganges, and the Ganges kind of a heart of this heart of the rivers of India.
Yeah.
So it's already catch some sort of a national and international attention. However reduced form it is, but we hope that one day with your lecture, with your insights, and what we have learned today from different dimensionalities of the cyclone studies, our colleagues, our friends, and our students can move forward and take it as a challenge. With that note, thank you so much once again, and we will be in touch.
Okay, I hope that your YouTube version of the presentation was in focus so that people can look at it later. But I'm willing to resend the presentation to anyone who's interested by Dropbox.
Okay. Yeah, and they can just Google you, and yeah, that's the email address. So that's not a big question. Regarding that technical thing, I would rather say that's maybe HD video for later use, or maybe I don't know. I'm not a technical person, so I'm helpless in this regard. It's just like came to me, and I played what it is. But the discussion itself feels a lot, and we got the clear message through the video. I mean, through your talk at least.
Okay.
I hope with that note we have lot to digest. And till then, we say goodbye, and also to promise to keep in touch as we keep on developing the program.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me, and I wish everyone the best. And let's stay in touch.
Thank you. Thank you. With that note, I'm ending the meeting. Thank you. Thank you to all the audience who has actually listened carefully for last like 1.5 hours or so, something like that. Thank you for your patience, questions. And if you have direct questions to Professor Pearl, he's a known personality, and just Google him, and you'll get the same email address that I got. And yeah, with that, you'll be in direct touch with him. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Meeting end,